Hi everyone, welcome back to Get Bookish. Bex here today to do a book review for you. This is on the third and final book that I needed to read for the Shelf Sisters series round 2. So Les picked this out from my TBR bookshelf and asked that I read it, and that is Atlantic, Great Sea Battles, Heroic Discoveries, Titanic Storms, and a Vast Ocean of a Million Stories by Simon Winchester. Now, it has been a while since we recorded that round 2 video, and it was definitely a bit of an intimidating read. I knew it was going to be a pretty dense nonfiction, but earlier this year I went on a cruise, and that cruise was going through the Atlantic Ocean, so I figured it would be appropriate to bring this along, and I did end up reading part of this, not all of this, while on a vessel in the Atlantic Ocean, so it felt pretty appropriate. Simon Winchester is a popular nonfiction author, but this is the first book of his that I've ever read, so I was curious to see how it went, because I know that there's a bunch of other things that I could pick up by him if I did like his writing. This starts with Simon getting on a ship from Europe to Canada. So it's very specific, a very personal story, and then once that is done, he backs way up and starts from the very beginning, like the creation of the Atlantic Ocean millions and millions of years ago. And so there is a mix of that sort of geological, natural side of things, and then also the personal, more human-centered stories. So depending on what you're into, what kind of topics you find interesting to read about, there will probably be sections of this book that you're very invested in, that you feel like you're flying through, and then there will be other sections that feel like a bit of a slog, and that was definitely what happened with me. Because there are so many different things to focus on with this topic, there are going to be points where there's just things that you're not as interested in, and then other points where you're really excited to see what you're going to learn. I generally don't lean towards the natural history side of things. I generally like the more social political aspects of stuff, but there were definitely sections in here that touched on the human side that I was not interested in. There was a section about musicians and painters and writers who'd been influenced by the Atlantic Ocean, and I was reading some poetry, I was hearing about musical, pieces, and I was learning about artists and seeing one painting, because this does have black and white photos in it. That was not a great way to experience that kind of material. I could feel my eyes glazing over when I was reading that section. However, there were plenty of other topics and focus points that I was really into. Although it was difficult to read about, there was a lot of coverage about the slave trade and also pirates, who were much more disgusting and horrible than kind of we've romanticized them to be these days. I also found myself really enjoying the section about war and how war on the high seas has been conducted and how it's changed over the years with the technology, and then also the sort of transportation of information and how we've gone from letters on ships to underwater cables. And I just kind of found those topics more interesting, probably because I just didn't know a ton about them. Because this book covers so many different things, if you're thinking about picking it up, there will likely be things in here that you are knowledgeable on. Maybe you know a lot about them, or maybe you've only heard a little bit about them. And for me, that was the cod collapse in Newfoundland. I was aware of the cod collapse that happened on the Grand Banks in Newfoundland, but it kind of all occurred before I was even born, and then coming to Canada later in life, it's one of those things that gets referenced politically off and on, and so I was vaguely aware of it being a thing, but I got a lot more details in here about how that came to be, and so I found myself like racing through that section because I just wanted to learn and understand more about what happened there. I think because it does still kind of affect me in some way today. Is that a topic that everybody would be interested in? Absolutely not. But I found myself getting really attached to it because it takes place in a country that I currently live in. It had that human aspect, it had that political aspect, and a little touch of that sort of natural side of things, but it all came together really well. And so that's the kind of thing that I loved learning about. The thing that I learned in here that I found the most surprising was that back in the day, not super far back in the day, not millions of years ago, but during more recent human history, when ships were carrying the cargo and the news from US, Canada over the Atlantic to England and Ireland and so on, that the ships that would carry that news, they would just leave whenever the captain felt ready to or whenever the cargo hold was full. Ships did not leave at a set date and time, and so that obviously became very difficult with the news and the sharing of information. So there was a group of men, these entrepreneurs, who started a company with a few ships that actually left at a specific date and time, even if the cargo hold wasn't full, even if the captain didn't necessarily want to. But it kind of revolutionized the industry because all of a sudden these ships actually had a set time, and so you knew that that letter that you were writing to go back home to your family was actually going to get there in a certain amount of time. And this created competition and to see which ships could sail the route the fastest. And it just kind of blew my mind that ships didn't have a set date and time in which they would leave. That just never occurred to me. It's one of those like tiny little things in this book, a paragraph, couple pages, this particular paragraph, and that was one of the things that stuck with me. So you're going to get very particular stories like that in here, which I really enjoyed. Along with those parts that I found fascinating or dull, there was also parts that I found really moving. The sea is a very dangerous place. There are dramatic stories, sad stories. There is a particular snippet at the end of this book that talks about a shipwreck that happened, and then two men that died trying to save the people from that shipwreck. And that was really actually touching to read about. And I thought it was a really good way to conclude this story, to kind of acknowledge how dangerous the sea can be, but how humans will kind of go above and beyond to help each other at times. So yeah, I really felt a range of emotion with this book because there are so many different tales to tell. All that being said, this book is still, at its core, a dense nonfiction book, and you do need to be able to focus while you're reading it. It's not the kind of book that I could read at the end of a long workday. I don't think it looks like it when I'm holding this, but this book has thin pages, and so it's actually quite long. The actual text of the book is over 450 pages, never mind the bibliography and index at the back. And so yeah, this book is a bit wordy. I do feel like Simon could have cut down on some of the sentences. I think his editor could have shortened his sentences a bit and maybe toned down some of the language. There were certain parts, particular sentences or paragraphs that I had to read multiple times because he kept interjecting different things and I would get confused about what the flow of the actual sentence was. So yes, it is dense, it is wordy, but if you know that going into it and you've read other Simon Winchesters before, I would definitely still say pick it up. That density could really weigh you down if you were stuck in a section that you weren't that interested in, and so for that reason I ended up giving this a 3.5 out of 5 stars. I did round it down on Goodreads, so it's a 3 out of 5 on there. This is not something that I would recommend to a new nonfiction reader. This is for somebody that's already into nonfiction and doesn't mind diving into a book that's going to at times challenge them. If you have this book on your TBR already, you already feel that pull to grab it, I would still suggest that you read it, just knowing that there is likely going to be parts of it that you're just not that into. And because this is a Shelf Sisters series pick and Les was curious about whether I thought she would enjoy it or not, I really have to end this with, should Les read this book? And Les is not a nonfiction reader in the same way that I am, and she's definitely not a dense nonfiction reader. So unfortunately, I wouldn't really recommend this for her. I feel like there are certain topics in here that Leslie would be very interested in, but you would probably want to read a nonfiction book that really focused on that particular topic and not something that's so broad like this one. Those are my thoughts on Atlantic by Simon Winchester. If you have read this book, I would be curious to know what you thought about it. And if it's on your TBR and you have some questions for me, leave them in the comments down below. I'd be happy to answer them. If you have read other Simon Winchester books that you enjoyed, you could definitely let me know which ones they were in the comments below. There are a number to choose from. There's kind of two that are on my radar right now. Outposts, which is one of his earlier ones where he visits a lot of British Empire Commonwealth outposts. And I got a little bit of a taste of that in here because he visits some really remote islands that are under the British Empire, and I found those parts really interesting. And then the other one that I'm kind of debating right now is Krakatoa. So if you have thoughts on any of his other books, feel free to share them as well. As always, there are links in the down bar to our Goodreads if you want to go follow us there. Thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you later.